It is my honor now to introduce Steve Jackson, who is a constitutional expert and lecturer, and he's going to provide an overview of the nation's Christian heritage and government. And I've heard Steve before, and you're going to enjoy his scholarly work. Please welcome Steve Jackson.
Get all the props in place here. Thank you for your patience. I'm asked to speak on America's Christian foundation. The title connotes biblical design elements from our country's past, and we'll be sharing a 15-minute sampling of that, including how faith and freedom relate. But I'll also be showing some images of recent events to illustrate the relevance of that foundation. Let me begin where David left off. In the aftermath of the 9/11 tragedy, talking heads on the news spun their lessons learned. The National Education Association urged teachers to use the event to teach that America must be more tolerant and warned teachers not to suggest that any particular group was responsible. Thank God for good Christian teachers soldiering on in government schools, but they're fighting a losing battle against a top-down system paralyzed by political correctness, where tolerance of wrong trumps all virtues. And we are all told, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're sincere. If we learn anything from September 11, 2001, it should be this: it matters a lot what people believe. Proverbs 23:7, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. The Islamic terrorists of 9/11 were sincere. Sincere people act on their beliefs. Providentially for us, America's founders believed in the God of the Bible. Most were Orthodox Christians who attended mainline Christian churches of diverse denominations. They all shared a biblical worldview. John Adams, the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the only principles in which that beautiful assembly of young gentlemen could unite, the general principles of Christianity. And to be fair to our Jewish friends, it is proper to refer to our religious foundation as Judeo-Christian, because many pieces of our foundation came from the Old Testament, BC. In the war year of 1943, past President Hoover issued a joint statement that applies as America faces multiple threats today. He said, "Menaced by collectivist trends, we must seek revival of our strength in the spiritual foundations which are the bedrock of our republic, the outgrowth of the religious convictions of the sacredness of every human life." America's founding fathers were smarter than I am, so I like to let them speak for themselves. A tiny sample of statements of Christian faith from just 3 of the more famous founders. George Washington wrote of Jesus Christ as the divine author of our blessed religion. John Adams, the Christian religion is, above all, the religion of wisdom, virtue, equity, and humanity. In other words, practical for civil order. Alexander Hamilton, as he lay dying after his duel with Aaron Burr, "I have a tender reliance on the mercy of the Almighty through the merits of the Lord Jesus Christ. I am a sinner. I look to him for mercy. Pray for me." In my professional career as a structural engineer in manned space, I was privileged to play a small part in some magnificent structures. But none was better designed than the U.S. Constitution, built on the foundation of principles in the Declaration of Independence. I submit that America's founders were good engineers. They acted on their beliefs, and we are the lucky recipients of the fruit of their good designs. In a word, freedom. At the foundation is the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the American view of law and government. There is a God, the God of the Bible. God is the source of law and rights, and the purpose of government is to secure our God-given rights. Forming the superstructure is the miraculous U.S. Constitution. It granted to the new government the powers it needed to be strong among the powers of the earth. It organizes those powers to effect our safety and happiness, and it limits those powers to a few and defined set necessary to protect life, liberty, and property within the narrow jurisdiction of the general government. Why limits? Lord Acton nailed it. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Because rulers have the same sin nature as those they govern, Thomas Jefferson reminds us, in questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. What did the Constitution's engineers say about it? George Washington on the adoption of the Constitution. It will demonstrate as visibly the finger of providence as any possible event in the course of human affairs. James Madison described the framing of the Constitution as a task more difficult than can be well conceived. It is impossible to consider the degree of concord which ultimately prevailed as less than a miracle. From where did our founding engineers get their ideas for that miracle at Philadelphia? Besides political philosophers like Cicero, Montesquieu, Blackstone, John Locke, and Vattel, the main source for the founders' education was the bestseller, the Bible. And when the founders spoke and wrote, fully 1/3 of their quotes came from the Bible, more than any other source. Daniel Webster, to the free and universal reading of the Bible in that age, men were much indebted for right views of civil liberty. If our founding fathers were the engineers of our government structure, then their preachers were its architects. David Barton, Sermons on the Biblical Principles of Government laid the intellectual basis for American independence. Pastors were the best educated men in the community, partly because 106 of America's first 108 colleges were founded primarily to train Christian clergy. So everyone looked to those pastors for knowledge, wisdom, and political advice. It is impossible to overstate the role these architects played in the design of our foundation. He looks a little bit like Pastor Chuck, doesn't he? Noah Webster, the learned clergy, had great influence in founding the first genuine Republican governments ever formed. The people of this country are indebted chiefly to their institutions for the rights and privileges which are enjoyed. Roger Williams was a Baptist minister who coined the phrase that Jefferson used to describe the biblical separation meant to protect church from state. Williams said, "Enforced uniformity confounds civil and religious liberty and denies the principles of Christianity and civility." Reverend Thomas Hooker preached a sermon to the Connecticut General Court on May 31st, 1638, that influenced the fundamental orders of Connecticut, which in turn influenced the U.S. Constitution. In it, Hooker explained the 3 biblical principles that had guided the plan of government in Connecticut. The choice of public magistrates belongs unto the people by God's own allowance. The privilege of election belongs to the people, and it is in their power also to set the bounds and limitations of the power and place. Colonial pastors preached election day sermons and political sermons. This example comes from Pastor Samuel West in 1776. Tyranny and arbitrary power are utterly inconsistent with and subversive of the very end and design of civil government, and directly contrary to natural law, which is the true foundation of civil government. Consequently, the authority of a tyrant is of itself null and void. The first national motto proposed for America in 1776 was, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," a summation of the famous 1750 sermon preached by Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, a principal figure in the Great Awakening. The scriptural model for this position was repeatedly validated when God himself raised up leaders such as Gideon, Ehud, Deborah, Jephthah, and Samson to throw off tyrannical governments. Leaders subsequently praised in Hebrews 11:32 for those defensive acts of faith. When the British imposed on Americans the 1765 Stamp Act, at the vanguard of the opposition to that act were the Reverends Charles Chauncey, Samuel Cooper, Jonathan Mayhew, and George Whitefield. British-born Whitefield even accompanied Benjamin Franklin to Parliament to protest the Stamp Act and to assert colonial rights. As early as 1687, the Reverend John Wise was already teaching that taxation without representation is tyranny, the consent of the governed is essential to free government, and that every man must be acknowledged equal to every man. But those pastors really practiced what they preached. When the nighttime alarm sounded in Lexington to warn of the oncoming British regulars, citizens gathered at the town green, and according to early historian Joel Headley, there they found their pastor, the Reverend Clark, who had arrived before them. The roll was called, and 150 answered to their names. The church, the pastor, and his congregation thus standing together in the dim light awaiting the redcoats. Even though the Minutemen are still honored in many texts, their leader, the Reverend Jonas Clark, is no longer mentioned, nor the fact that many of the Minutemen were deacons in his church, nor the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, who led 300 men from his church against the British as one of Washington's most trusted generals. Mighty men they were, of iron nerve and strong hand and unblanched cheek and heart of flame. The British coined a name for them, the Black-Robed Regiment, dreading them for the influence they wielded and hating them for the courage they infused into the colonists. The British directed the cruelest retribution toward them and their churches, as depicted in Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot. An honest assessment of American history commands gratitude to those architect preachers and to our engineer founders. Returning to the present for a moment, what did NASA learn from the Challenger tragedy of January 28, 1986? Hopefully, listen to the engineers. The engineering specs for the rubber seals in the solid rocket boosters set limits on the temperature for safe launch. The rules said it was too cold that day, but NASA didn't listen to the engineers. The laws of nature are rules that will not be broken without cost. It was the laws of nature and nature's God, or natural law, that Jefferson cited as the very basis for declaring independence. It was to secure the blessings of liberty that the Constitution's specifications were written to achieve a precise balance of liberty under law. That delicate balance is threatened today by any number of dangerous foreign ideologies like Islam and by domestic tyranny. Most of America's problems today are the result of not listening to the engineers of our Constitution. Most of America's problems today were solved by those engineers almost 220 years ago when they wrote the rules to bind down the government by the chains of the Constitution. Foolishly, we just stopped listening to the engineers and started listening to the siren song of socialism, godless socialism, masquerading behind enticing names. These recent stories represent a small sampling of how the federal government has insinuated itself into our businesses, our churches, our police, and our most intimate personal affairs. Unconstitutional acts are legion. And time doesn't allow me any detail, but most involve violation of the Constitution's most basic doctrine, that of enumerated powers, whereby most powers are reserved to the states or to the people, as the 10th Amendment requires. The feds usurp powers not granted in Article 1, Section 8, and deny rights protected by the Bill of Rights, always on some pretext like saving the planet, or general welfare, or interstate commerce, or safety. Speaking of safety, Benjamin Franklin said, "They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Galatians 5:1, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." Freedom is not so much the right to choose, it is the result of making right choices. This is a message of love, not hate. The founders thought and acted biblically. Listen to the engineers tell us about the inseparable relationship between faith and freedom. Without the foundation of Christianity, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty. The Christian religion in its purity is the basis and source of all genuine freedom in government. No human society has ever been able to maintain order and freedom apart from the moral precepts of the Christian religion applied and accepted by all the classes. The Americans combine the notions of Christianity and liberty so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive the one without the other. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants. James Madison referred to the details of the Constitution when he said, "Every word of it decides a question between power and liberty." The details go even deeper. Because it was common practice in the founding era, the Constitution's authors capitalized the first letter of words to add emphasis. The familiar words, "to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity," appear in the preamble. Why do you think ourselves has a small o, while posterity has a capital P? Where is the emphasis? Posterity is like a relay race. Each generation runs its leg and must hand off the baton to the next. The baton is a humble thing. It's past, a simple but monumental act. Do you remember the 2008 Summer Olympic Games in Beijing? The U.S. sent a dream team of track stars. Both our men's and women's relay teams were stacked with the fastest runners, individual gold medalists who each had plenty of relay experience. Experts said our men's and women's relay teams were assured of Olympic gold. They were so confident that because of their crowded event schedules, they didn't bother practicing the simple baton passes they had all done hundreds of times before. I remember. Neither our men's nor women's 4x100 relay teams got to run for their gold. Both those men's and women's teams disqualified themselves in preliminary heats because they failed to execute that simple baton pass. Their dream ended. It didn't matter how fast or strong they were. It doesn't matter how strong and free we are. If we and the next generation did not execute passing the baton of faith and freedom, the American dream ends. At age 70, Daniel Webster said, "If we and our posterity shall be true to the Christian religion, we may have the highest hopes of the future fortunes of our country. But if we and our posterity reject religious instruction and authority, violate the rules of eternal justice, trifle with the injunctions of morality, and recklessly destroy the political constitution, no man can tell how sudden a catastrophe may overwhelm us. That shall bury all of our glory in profound obscurity. It matters what we believe." Thomas Jefferson said, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be." Government schools aren't teaching faith and freedom. They're dumbing down our students, teaching them atheism and slavish dependency on big government. Where will our children learn about faith and freedom? The logical place is the place our founders learned it, the church. I call on the church to teach faith and freedom. Civil government is one of the three human institutions ordained by God. Church leaders throughout history have addressed issues of civil government. Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Rutherford, and our own Puritan forebears. They taught that God limits civil government to its biblical jurisdiction. Dr. John Eidsmoe says the refusal of today's Christians to address issues of law and government is a modern heresy. Much of the Bible addresses law and government. If we ignore what the Bible says about those topics, we are not preaching the whole counsel of God. I call on the pastors of America to step up and introduce your congregations to the biblical worldview of the founders. Why not another great awakening? Jeremiah 6:16, "Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way? And walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls." The Bible, the Declaration, and the Constitution are good ways. I call on the pastors of America to be the architects of another American revolution, a peaceful one. In the tradition of colonial architect preachers, teach your flocks to think and walk biblically and constitutionally, like our engineer founders. There are great organizations with faith and freedom resources to assist you. Some that I use are listed on the outline of this talk, available at my table outside. WellBuilders invites pastors to actually join the new Black Robe Regiment. I call on the church to help pass the baton of faith and freedom. Thank you, and may God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass the baton to Mary, who will pick up the education theme and run with it.
Thank you, Steve.